Chapter 3. Ignorance. The sage alone can rightly diagnose our ills and prescribe the right remedy. He alone can unravel the tangled skein of right and wrong knowledge which fills our minds. The first thing that the sages tell us is that the cause of all our sufferings is in ourselves alone, not outside. The Buddha is reported to have said, "You suffer from yourselves alone. No one compels you." The sage of ARUNACHALA says the same thing. In answer to a question whether there is something radically wrong in the world scheme itself, he said, "The world is all right as it is. It is we that are to blame because of our own mistaken way of thinking. What we have to do is to trace the initial error that is at the back of our minds and pluck it out. Then it will be all right." This finding and plucking out of our fundamental error is the only radical cure there is. All other remedies are only palliatives. The utmost that can be said for them is that, in their own way, they help to lead us on to the right remedy. The religious faiths and practices that divide the world are of value only to this extent. Often they only enthrall and weaken the mind, and thus postpone the day of deliverance. In fact, from this point of view, a sincere and earnest skeptic may be far better off than the bigoted believer. The kind of believer that has not the sense to see that all these religions are for humanity, not humanity for the religions. Such a one holds his beliefs not lightly and tentatively, as something that may possibly be falsified by the actual experience of truth, to which it is only a means, but as the veritable truth itself. The so-called skeptic is in truth no skeptic if he believes that there is something which is true, and that it alone matters. It is safe to say that he that is devoted to the truth is the best of all devotees. No believer is worthy of regard if he fails to perceive that truth is all in all, and that beliefs should be held sacred for the sake of the truth alone, and not otherwise. Such a one is in a much worse position than the honest and earnest skeptic, because in the first place he is very unlikely to take up the inquiry that is sketched in these chapters. In the second place, if he goes to a living sage and seeks guidance from him, he is very likely to misunderstand what the sage might tell him. For this reason, it happens that the sages, as a rule, do not give out all the teachings they have in them to all questioners alike. They withhold the deeper truths from those whose minds are unopened. For a truth that is misunderstood is more fatal than sheer ignorance. Whoever, therefore, is willing to be fully instructed by a sage must be prepared to put aside his own beliefs. He must not be fanatically attached to any creed. The open-minded disciple, who has little or no book knowledge, is thus in a better position than the learned ones with minds enslaved by their creeds. With open minds, then, we go to the sage and ask him why we are in bondage to desires and fears. He replies that it is so, because we do not know ourselves aright, that we think ourselves to be something that we are not. At the first thought, it may appear that this answer is doubly wrong. We are unable to see how a right knowledge of ourselves can be necessary to the business of life. We want to know how to bend this world to our wills, or, as the next best thing, how to adjust ourselves to the world, so that we may be able to make the best of the world, bad as it is. We do not see how knowing ourselves aright can be of any help to us in all this. In the second place, we are fully persuaded that we do know ourselves aright. We believe that knowledge is of great value, and seek to know the truth about everything that we might possibly come across in life. We are even so fanatical in this that we want to make the acquisition of knowledge compulsory for all. And all this knowledge concerns the world, not ourselves. In the course of centuries, every single nation or group of nations had piled up vast heaps of knowledge. History, geography, astronomy, chemistry, physics, ethics, theology, biology, sociology, and even what goes by the proud name of philosophy or metaphysics. If all this be knowledge, then along with the piling up of these heaps of it, there must have been a steady increase in human happiness. But this is not the case. It may be claimed that increase of knowledge has given us a greater mastery over the blind forces of nature, and that this is all too good. But it is not so, for this mastery has been placed by an untoward fate in the hands of a few, and the greater this mastery becomes, the deeper is the degradation and despair into which the masses sink. And the sense of their unrelieved misery cannot but poison the cup of happiness, or seeming happiness, for those among the fortunate few who are not wholly self-centered. The millennium, which the scientists of a now forgotten age prophesied, is now farther off than ever. In fact, science has now brought the world to a state in which the very life of the human race is being seriously threatened. No, it is sheer wickedness, unworthy of one that aspires to a pure and untainted happiness, to contend that all this knowledge has been to the good. And this should lead us to suspect that this is no knowledge at all. We may at least suspect that happiness is not to be had through this kind of knowledge. The teaching of the sages confirms this suspicion. The sage of ARUNACHALA goes even so far as to characterize all this knowledge as ignorance. Once a young man, fresh from his university, one who had studied science as his special subject, came to the sage and asked him about the blank wall of ignorance, which faces the scientist in his quest of the ultimate truth of the universe. Investigating the infinitely small, he was just able to guess at the existence and behavior of certain mysterious entities called electrons, protons, positrons, and neutrons, but could not get at them and know them at first hand, not to speak of finding the one ultimate substance, the cause of all. On the other hand, in his researches into the infinitely large, he could not get beyond the nebulae or star, dust supposed to be the raw material of creation, nor could he discover the secret of the fundamentals of all objectivity, namely time and space. The sage replied that questioning the outside world can never lead to anything but ignorance. He said that when one seeks to know anything other than himself, without caring to know the truth of himself, the knowledge he obtains cannot possibly be right knowledge. This might seem to us a very strange reason for the discrediting of all human knowledge at one stroke, but a little dispassionate thinking will make it clear that the sage is right. In the first place, as seen above, this knowledge is already suspect because it has failed to promote human happiness. In the second place, there is nothing like a real unanimity among those whom we regard as knowing ones. Often this want of unanimity does not come to the knowledge of the general public, because the great majority of those who are supposed to know are agreed, and they make all the noise, while the more knowing ones, who strongly disagree from the majority, are practically silent. And it does often happen that these are in the right and not the vocal majority, who are mostly mediocre minds. The common man assumes that there is such a thing as science apart from the scientist, but as in religion or philosophy, so in science, there are differences of opinion due to the differences in natural intelligence and character. It was observed by Mr. Bernard Shaw that the conversion of a savage to Christianity is really the conversion of Christianity to savagery. For the savage does not cease to be one by being baptized and taught a catechism. The pursuit of truth demands on the part of a seeker certain perfections of head and heart, which are certainly rare. Universal education has certainly not succeeded in increasing the number of really competent investigators. Hence it is that with the same data, different people come to different conclusions. Hence we must be willing to concede that the sage must be right after all. The reason given by the sage is that he that would know the truth of anything whatever must first know himself aright. He means that he that does not know himself begins with an initial error, which falsifies all the knowledge he gains by his inquiries. From this error the self-knower is free, and hence he alone is competent to find the truth of the world or of the things in the world. The quality of the would-be knower is an inescapable element in the knowledge gained by him. It would be right knowledge only if the would-be knower were rightly equipped for the quest of knowledge. This is the true explanation of the fact, though many might deny it, that science has failed. The scientist assumes that he does not need to know himself aright. In any case, he starts on his inquiry into objective reality with certain notions about the self that are wrong. But do we not know ourselves? We think we do. The average man is very positive that he knows himself aright, and it may not be possible for him to realize that he does not, even if he listens to a sage. For it requires a very advanced and greatly purified mind even to perceive and acknowledge the fact that we do not know ourselves, that those notions about ourselves that we have cherished all along are mistaken. Sages tell us that our notions of ourselves are a mixture of truth and error. Once a few followers of faith, which very vehemently condemns the use of idols, came to the sage and started questioning him. Their aim was to obtain from him an admission that it is wrong to worship God in an idol. Their spokesman asked the sage, "Has God any form?" The sage said in reply, "Who says that God has form?" The questioner then said, "If God is formless, then is it not wrong to worship him in an idol?" The sage said, "Let God alone. Tell me if you have a form or not." The questioner promptly answered, "Yes, I have a form, as you see." The sage said, "What, are you this body, which is about 3.5 cubits in height, dark in color, and mustached and bearded?" "Yes," came the answer. "Are you this in your dreamless sleep also?" "Of course, for on awaking I find myself to be the same." "Also, when the body dies?" "Yes." "If so, why does not the body say to the people when they are preparing to take it away for burial, 'No, you must not take me away. This house is mine, and I want to remain here'?" Then at last the disputant realized his error. He said, "I was wrong. I am not the body. I am the life that dwells in it." Then the sage explained, "Look here, until now you quite seriously believed that this body is yourself, but now you see that you are wrong in this. Understand that this is the initial ignorance, out of which grows inevitably all the ignorance that enslaves men. So long as this primal ignorance remains, it does not matter much whether you regard God as with form or formless. But when this primal ignorance goes, then with it will go all the rest." The sage, we thus see, diagnoses the disease, bondage to desire and fears, as due to ignorance of our true selves, and the consequent false assumption that the body is the self. And this is confirmed by the observation that desire and fear arise because of the body. Most of us are no wiser than the disputant in this dialogue, we are all of us fully persuaded that the body, which is so constantly in our thoughts and which is the object of all our anxious care, is the self. The above dialogue shows also that in this belief we are wrong. In the above dialogue, the disputant believed in the immortality of the self, and hence he could not but acknowledge that he had been mistaken. But there are the materialist and the atheist who contend that there is no self other than the body. But when we have a sage for our instructor, the arguments of these people do not prevail with us, for the sage speaks with the authority of direct experience, and we are far more ready to believe him than these half-philosophers. But the sage does not say in so many words, "You must believe me because I have first-hand knowledge of this fact." On the contrary, he seeks to persuade us by means of arguments based on our own experience. The full force of these arguments may possibly be difficult to realize until the whole of his revelation is mastered. We shall, for the present, be satisfied with a brief statement of them. In the first place, the self has a continuous existence in all the three states of being known to us, namely waking, dream, and sound sleep, while the body exists only in the first two and not in the third. This will not be quite convincing, especially to those whose minds are deeply entangled in materialistic ways of thinking. But even they can see that there is a state, namely sleep, in which the self exists without the body. Another argument is that the self is the one indubitable reality, while the reality of all other things, including the body and the mind, is in doubt. This argument will become understandable when we go through the chapter on the world. When we realize the full force of these arguments, we shall no more be troubled by the arguments of the materialist. But then one may ask, what about those devotees and philosophers who profess to know that the body is not the self, who cannot possibly believe that the body and the self are identical, being steadfast believers in the existence of a self distinct from the body? These maintain that the soul is an extremely subtle being, who inhabits the body as one inhabits a house, using it for a time and leaving it afterwards to inhabit another body. Are they not, by their steadfastness in this belief, protected from this illusion? Are they too ignorant, like the disputant in the dialogue set forth above? It is true that they at first believe that by their belief they are raised to a level above the common people, but in due course they are disillusioned. They come to see that their knowledge is purely theoretical, not practical, that they are in no way better than the rest. They find themselves still confounding the body, gross or subtle, with the self, just as others do. If the body be short, they are short. If it be tall, they are tall. If it be fair, they are fair. If it be weak and diseased, they themselves are so. And if it be improved and made healthy, they themselves are made so. In the same way they treat the mind as the self. If the mind be alert or joyous or clear, or the opposite, they themselves are so. The bondage to desire and fear is not even less than before. It is perhaps even tighter than before on account of the added elements of self-esteem. We are told by the sages that we shall cease to identify ourselves with these bodies, and thus be free, once for all, from the sufferings that come through them. Only when we attain direct experience of the real self, just as we now have direct experience of the body as the self, so we must have direct experience of that self as he really is. This ignorance is an ingrained habit of thought, which has been bred in the mind through a long course of wrong acting and thinking. Out of it have arisen numerous attachments to things. These thought habits form the very structure of the mind, and the mere introduction of a contrary thought, which is a very weak one, just like a newly born infant, will make very little difference. The mind will still flow along the same habit channels. It will still be subject to the same attractions and repulsions, and this will be so because while it may be possible for the book-learned philosopher to be able to feel at times that he is not the body, he cannot, with equal facility, come to feel that he is not the mind. And this double ignorance will cease only when the self is known, not theoretically but practically, that is, by actual experience of the self. Until that realization dawns, the philosopher cannot be said to have thrown off his ignorance. It survives in all its vigor. His philosophical lore does not even make any difference in his character. In fact, as the sage points out, the book-taught philosopher is even worse off than other men. His egoism is swelled by the pride of knowledge. His heart is beset with new attachments, from which the illiterate are free, which leave him no time for the enterprise of finding the real self. Often he is even unaware of the very urgent necessity of preparing himself for that enterprise by harmonizing the contents of his mind and directing his energies towards the self instead of the world. Hence it follows that he that knows the self from books alone knows it no more than humbler folk. For this reason the sage likens him to a gramophone. He is no better for his book lore than the gramophone is for the good things it repeats. Books, we should remember, are no more than signposts on the road to the wisdom that makes us free. That wisdom is not in the books themselves, for the self that we need to know is within, not outside. If and when the eye of wisdom is opened, the self will be found shining in all its glory, directly without any medium, but the study of book engenders the notion that the self is something outside, needing to be known as an object through the medium of the mind. The vast confusion that prevails in philosophical and theological speculations is due, says the sage, to this ignorance. Everyone is fully persuaded that the abstruse questions concerning the world, the soul, and God can be settled finally and satisfactorily by intellectual speculation sustained by arguments drawn from common human experience, which is what it is because of this ignorance. Philosophers and theologians have disputed from the very beginning of creation, if there was a creation, about the first cause, the mode of creation, the nature of time and space, the truth or otherwise of the world, the conflict of fate and free will, the state of deliverance, and so on without end. But no finality has been reached. The sage explains to us that there can be no final conclusion, such that it cannot be upset by new or seemingly new arguments advanced by fresh disputants, unless and until the real self is realized. For him that has realized that self, these controversies come to an end. But for others, they must continue, unless they hearken to the advice of the sage, which is to the effect that they should leave all these questions on one side and devote themselves wholeheartedly to the quest of the self. Either we must accept the teaching of sages on these matters, at least tentatively, so that we shall no more be diverted from the quest by these disputes, or we should recognize the profound truth that these questions are of no importance at all and need no answer, that the one thing needed is to find the self. For these questions arise, if at all, only to those that look upon the mind or the body as the self. We thus understand that all our sufferings are due to our ignorance of the real self. This ignorance must be removed. if we are ever to enjoy real happiness. For removal of the cause is the only radical cure there is. All else is a palliative treatment, which may even do harm in the long run by actually adding to the disease. And we can get rid of this ignorance only by actual experience of the self. This is no easy task, for the instrument by which we must work at it is the mind. It has to be turned aside from all else and towards the true self. But the mind does not readily turn aside from its customary preoccupations. If forcibly turned aside, it does not stay so, but soon turns back to them. This is because the mind is full of notions which are the progeny of this ignorance, and these notions naturally rise up in arms to defend the life of their parent, this ignorance, for its life is also their own. We have therefore to liquidate all these notions. Because these notions are the progeny of this primary ignorance, they are presumably false, and it stands to reason that false knowledge is inimical to the dawn of the truth. Therefore also it is needful for us to examine these notions and reject them if they are found to be incorrect, or even if only doubtful. Thus alone shall we be secure against traitorous outbreaks behind us, when we are engaged in the quest of the real self. In this examination we must be guided by absolute devotion to the truth. The Gita tells us, "He that loves the truth and subdues his whole being to the love of the truth shall find it." This condition is very important. Surely there can be no partial love of the truth. Such love implies a love of untruth in greater or less degree. Perfect love of the truth means a perfect readiness to renounce whatever shall be found to be untrue as a result of an impartial examination. It also implies ability to submit to a thorough examination all the beliefs we now have about the world, the soul, and God, without attachment to those beliefs. It is the mark of the truth lover that he is no more attached to his own beliefs than to those of another. He holds those beliefs tentatively and can calmly contemplate the possibility of finding that they are untenable and worthy to be renounced. It is the freedom from attachment to one's beliefs that enables him to make an impartial examination of their validity. And if as a result of such examination he finds that they are invalid, he not only renounces them, but is ever on his guard against their possible return until they lose their power on him. Therefore we must see to it that we shall be devoted to the truth and the truth alone, untainted by errors. And for its sake we must renounce the love we bear to our present beliefs, so that the truth may reign supreme in our hearts when we have found it. What is known as philosophy is just this impartial scrutiny of all our notions, of the entire contents of our minds. This alone is true philosophy. All else is pseudo-philosophy, and it is safe to say that pseudo-philosophers are those who have either not understood the fact they are ignorant of the self, or are quite content to remain in subjection to that ignorance. We shall now consider how to make sure that in our philosophizing we shall avoid the pitfalls that lurk on our path, and arrive at notions which shall not be inimical to our pursuit of the quest of the true self. Chapter 4. Authority. We have seen that before taking up the quest of the real self, whereby we shall become free from bondage to desire and fear, we have to prepare ourselves for it by revising our ideas and casting off those that are at all likely to hamper the pursuit of the quest. This revision of our present ideas as a preparation for the quest is called philosophy, for philosophy is a means and not an end in itself. But there are philosophies and philosophies. Unless it is of the right kind, it will, instead of leading us to the quest, actually lead us deeper into the ignorance that is the cause of all our ills. The right kind of philosophy is an impartial criticism of all our present notions about the three things: the world, the soul, and God. Those philosophies whose aim is to confirm these notions are inimical to success in the quest. They are to be avoided. Philosophy, therefore, to be really helpful, must begin with a recognition of the primary ignorance that is pointed out in the foregoing chapter. This means that all our present ideas are suspect, for the reason given by the sage and explained in the same chapter. They must be subjected to a thorough criticism and replaced by other ideas which shall be unobjectionable and helpful to the quest. In the course of this criticism, we shall need to consider the evidence for or against the validity of our ideas. But the evidence we are to rely upon must be of the right kind. What is the right kind of evidence? Is it the common experience of men? That experience is the outcome of the primary ignorance. To rely on such evidence would only result in giving the stump of philosophical truth to the ideas we criticize. We require evidence of a different kind. We can now understand how it happens that philosophy has earned a name for futility. It is undeniable that philosophies have, as a rule, failed to give us any real help in solving the riddle of life. This has been particularly so in the West. This failure was evidently due to their use of evidence of the wrong kind. They used as evidence the common experience of mankind, which, as we have seen, is bad as being the offspring of our ignorance. And they used this wrong kind of evidence because they began their philosophies without a recognition of this ignorance. Naturally, they arrived at conclusions which confirmed that ignorance barred the way to deliverance. Some tell us that the body is the self. Others say that the mind is the self. Both agree in asserting that the world is real and that the self is an individual, one of a vast multitude of cells. Some there are who admit that the self is neither the body nor the mind as we know it, but imagine that there is a superior kind of mind which is the real self. All these views agree in making it out that the self is finite. But finiteness is the cause of bondage. If, as these philosophers say, the self is really finite in its very nature, then we must bid goodbye to all hope of becoming free. Thus there is no vital difference among these views. These philosophies cannot at all help us in getting rid of our primary ignorance. He that would philosophize aright must avoid the mistakes of these philosophers. He must choose his evidence aright. He must seek and find evidence of experience which is not the outcome of the ignorance. Reliable evidence, therefore, is not the experience of ignorant men, but that of sages, who are wholly free from this ignorance. Only on the basis of their experience can we build up a philosophy that would relax the grip that this ignorance now has on us, and thus make it possible for us to start on the quest and pursue it to the very end, so that we may win similar experience for ourselves. That the truth cannot be reached without evidence other than the experience of common humanity was felt by Professor James of America. He sought to supply that need to the best of his power in his book Varieties of Religious Experience. In that book he made free use of the contents of another book, namely Cosmic Consciousness by Dr. Buck. The evidence gathered into these books is that of exceptional men. But all this evidence has been treated uncritically because the authors had no clear notion of the primary ignorance. There are at least 3 classes of exceptional men, and all of them are not of the same grade. That is to say, those who have given evidence of exceptional experiences belong to one of 3 classes, namely yogis, saints, and sages. We need to discriminate among them and find out which of these are the proper witnesses in our inquiry. The evidence of the yogis is unreliable because they have not transcended the realm of ignorance. This is seen in the fact that they differ among themselves. The same is the case with the saints. The sages do not differ among themselves because they have transcended the ignorance. No sage ever contradicts another sage. Revelation tells us that all sages are one. We shall be able to recognize the correctness of this teaching later on. As between the yogis and the saints, the latter are far more worthy to be followed than the former, though we need to discriminate between saint and saint because, as we shall see in the chapter on devotion, their views differ according to the degree of their ripeness. The nearer they are to sagehood, the wiser are their utterances. And there are saints whose utterances are of a mischievous tendency. We also find that saints have moods, or rather that moods have them, which is not the case with sages. The experiences of the yogis are highly complex, and therefore their descriptions have an irresistible fascination for us. But the fact is, they are not even conscious of the empire that the ignorance has over them. Their goal is not the ending of ignorance, but the attainment, within the realm of ignorance, of a glorious status that seems to them worthy of being striven for. They are persuaded that the mind itself is the self, and this is the case even when they deny it. They believe in a blissful existence in which the mind shall survive, though infinitely glorified and endowed with wonderful powers. This they consider to be the highest possible gain. Some of them are more ambitious still. They hope to be able, after winning these powers, which they wrongly call deliverance, to obtain control over the world and then to change it beyond recognition, to erect a tangible heaven on earth. The saints are free from these ambitions. That neither yogis nor saints can have a right vision of the truth was clearly pointed out by the sage Shankara in his Viveka Chudamani, verse 365. He tells us that the vision of the truth obtained by non-sages is apt to be distorted by the interference of the mind, which is not the case with the sages. According to the sages, this glorified mind of the yogis is but a body of a subtler kind. The notion that this is the self is simply the primary ignorance in a more dangerous form. The common man is, in fact, in a much better state than the yogi, for the latter has only gone deeper into the ignorance and postponed the day of deliverance. With all due respect, therefore, to the yogis, we must reject their evidence. The saints as a class are worthy of reverence, but for the present we must put on one side their evidence also, and build up our philosophy on the evidence of the sages alone. But after we shall have done this, we may take up the evidence of the saints, make a study of it in the light of the teachings of the sages. This study has a great value for us, as we shall see in due course. There have been sages in every age down to the present. Their testimony has come down to us enshrined in certain books called Upanishads or Vedantas. There are many passages in the books which carry conviction straight to the heart. In fact, it is the heart of all life, the real self, that speaks to us in them. The student is thus simultaneously aware of 2 things: that the teaching is true, and that the teacher is a sage. But there can be no doubt that the earnest disciple would prefer to these books the words of a living sage, if he can find one. There can be honest doubt about the genuineness of the text of the ancient revelation, but we can have none whatever of the genuineness of the teachings of a living sage, and we are on much stronger ground if the sage has himself written down his teachings. There's also this further advantage. If we happen to be in doubt about the correct meaning of any passage, we shall apply to the best possible commentator, namely the giver of the revelation, the sage himself. The disciples of the sage of ARUNACHALA are therefore in a much better position than those that rely on the older books or on pundits who have studied those books. The sage has written down his teachings and has himself explained the meanings of some of the passages. He has also given oral answers to a great many questions that have been put to him from time to time, and these answers have been recorded fairly accurately by disciples. Of course, apart from these considerations, it is a great thing to attach oneself to a living sage, as the older revelation tells us. Those that fail to do so are losing a great chance. It is not possible for a teacher who is not a sage, who is just a pundit and nothing more, to understand the spirit of the ancient revelation. Still less is it possible for him to rouse the spiritual energies that are latent in the disciple, for the reason that he himself has not had them roused. It is necessary that the guru or master that is to teach us should himself be the embodiment of that wisdom which he is to impart to us. The teaching of our sage is therefore for us the new revelation. And for the reasons pointed out, this revelation is the most authoritative for us. We should take it as the chief basis of our philosophy, and utilize the older revelation also, insofar as it may serve to explain or complete the teaching. There is, of course, the unexpressed view of orthodox pundits, namely that the ancient revelation is the primary authority, and that the words of a living sage are authoritative only as echoes of that revelation. We shall come to this view later on. Just now we shall seek to obtain a clear and rational notion of what is known as authority. Authority is just the testimony of the sages, giving us an idea of their own experience of the true self, transcending the ignorance. It is called authority because it is the only reliable evidence we have about the true self and the state of deliverance, so long as we ourselves are subject to that ignorance. There is an apparent conflict between authority and reason. A European student of philosophy who for some years sat at the feet of the sage once remarked to the sage that, as history shows, this is the age of reason, and hence it is necessary that the teaching we shall listen to and accept must be in accordance with reason. The sage replied as follows: "Who is the intellect? You must answer, my intellect. So the intellect is your tool. You use it for measuring variety. It is not yourself, nor is it something independent of you. You are the abiding reality. Well, the intellect is just a phenomenon. You must find and get hold of yourself. There is no intellect in dreamless sleep. There is none in a child. The intellect develops with age. But how could there be any development or manifestation of the intellect without the seed of it in sleep or childhood? Why go to history to discover the fundamental fact? The degree of truth in history is the same as the degree of truth in the historian. We may put it this way: the usefulness of the intellect is limited by its origin, namely the primary ignorance. To those that are unaware of their subjection to this ignorance, and to those also who are content to remain in subjection to it, the intellect is a good enough tool for all their purposes. That is to say, it is an excellent tool in the service of that ignorance. But for the purpose of transcending it, it is of little use. The utmost that the intellect can do for us is to recognize its own limitations and cease to hinder our quest of the truth. This it can do as soon as it begins to realize the fact of its own tainted origin and of the necessity of relying on the evidence of the sages as a step in aid of the quest, by which an authentic revelation of the true self can be won. Thus, the conflict between reason and revelation is only apparent. Our reliance on the testimony of the sages is not unreasonable, also because such reliance is only tentative. The sages tell us about the real self and the way to obtaining the direct experience of that self. Not that we may blindly believe whatever they tell us, but that we may verify their teaching by our own experience of the truth of that self. The essential part of their teaching is not what they tell us about the state of deliverance or the true nature of the self, but what they tell us about the method of winning that state. That is why this sage always tells the disciple, to begin with, that he must find the self by means of the quest taught by himself. Whatever else he teaches is auxiliary to the quest, and we are to accept all this teaching only tentatively, so that we may be able to take up the quest and carry it through to the point of success. All sense of conflict between reason and faith in the Guru will vanish as we proceed in the study of the teaching. The sages, as a rule, appeal to our own experience as worldly men, and the sage of Arunachala is no exception. It is true, as we saw already, that our experience is discredited as the offspring of the primary ignorance. But even out of it, the sages are able to pick out facts that make it easier for us to accept their teaching, revolutionary as it seems to be at almost every step. The light that they shed on our own past experience enables us to see that in truth there is no real conflict between faith and reason. This being the true nature of what has been called authority, it follows that in the last resort everyone is his own authority. Before accepting the teaching of a sage as authoritative, he must decide for himself whether or not he is a sage. A person having intimate experience of the real self and established by virtue of that experience in the state of deliverance, which he himself wants to attain. He must come to the conclusion that the person in question is in the enjoyment of unalloyed and uninterrupted happiness, due to his freedom from desire and fear, the two enemies of happiness. The disciple is not asked to surrender his reason until he finds one to whom he can surrender it with the prospect of incalculable gain. The sage, to whom he makes this surrender, becomes his guru or master. It is not possible to lay down clear rules to guide the novice in the delicate business of recognizing a sage, and it may be said that no rules are really necessary. He that is destined to find a sage and to become his disciple will find no practical difficulty in recognizing him when he finds him. For those that are not so destined, rules will be of little use. Divine grace plays a decisive part in the process by which the sage is recognized as such and accepted as one's own guru. But when once the choice is made, the disciple can use the available test of sagehood in order to confirm his choice. The chief test is serenity and unruffled happiness, which is the same as perfect peace. Another test is egolessness, and this is proved chiefly by the indifference to praise and censure, as noted before. Other tests will appear in the course of this exposition. We shall now discuss the notion of authority which is upheld by the orthodox pandit who has not sat at the feet of a sage. This notion is as follows. There are certain books which are unquestionably authoritative in their entirety, because they are of divine origin. Every sentence or clause of a sentence in them is divine, and it is not permissible to us to doubt their authenticity and authority. It is said that the books prove themselves, that they are svata prananam. In this sense, authority is a kind of spiritual dictatorship imposed from without. The subservience of the seeker of the truth goes further still. Not only must he accept the sacred lore as authoritative, but he must also bind himself in advance to accept the interpretations of disputed passages which these pundits offer. This notion is one of the many untoward effects of the organization of religions into churches or hierarchies. It must be said that this notion is good enough for the man who is content to live and die in ignorance. He that wills to rise above it needs authority of a different kind. Even the sacred lore is of relative value, and needs evidence of some kind to prove its worth. There is only one thing that proves itself, namely the self. The upholders of the orthodox view do not recognize the testimony of a living sage as having any authority of its own. They believe that a special sacredness attaches to the ancient lore and that no additions can be made to it. But the truth is the other way about. The reason for the authoritative nature of the ancient lore is the fact that it contains passages which are more or less faithful records of the testimony of sages that lived in the past. And sages are the same at all times. As the ancient lore itself tells us, they are not in time, but transcend it. Further, in the sacred lore, we have the injunction that we should receive instruction from a living sage. The truth is that the sage is not a person, but an embodiment of divinity, as the Gita tells us in the words, "The sage is myself." And this, which is one of the fundamental teachings of the ancient lore, seems to be insufficiently understood by the pundits. Besides, the most natural way for us is to start with the teaching of a living sage, for we are able to determine by our intuitive perception whether the teacher is a sage or not. We cannot thus judge any sage of the past. Besides, we can never be quite sure that the books as we now find them are a faithful record of what the sages had said. It seems probable that these books are made up of the actual utterances of sages and other passages composed by philosophers who were not sages. It would seem that the evidentiary text remained unrecorded for a long time before they were incorporated into the books. During the interval, the text must have been preserved by oral tradition, which may account for the fact that the same passages occur in different books, but with variations. The claim that is made for the ancient lore is based on its being prior in time, but priority in time is no consideration at all in any inquiry in which the validity of time itself, as an objective reality, is in question, as we shall see in due course. Our first reliance, therefore, shall be on the testimony of the sage of Arunachala. We shall make use of the ancient lore by way of amplification or commentary. Chapter 5. The World. We have seen that the truth of the self will reveal itself when the mind persists in the quest of the self, actuated by the resolve to find that truth. This the mind can do if it be not deflected from the quest by extraneous thoughts. The mind that is not so deflected is an apt instrument for finding the self. In the case of the sage of Arunachala, the mind was such an apt instrument, because it was untainted by desires or attachments which could raise a current of thoughts diverting the mind from the quest. For such a one, it is unnecessary to engage in discussions about the world. Says the sage, of what use are disputes about the world, saying that it is real, that it is an illusory appearance, that it is conscious, that it is insentient, that it is happy, that it is miserable. All men alike love the egoless state, which is won by turning away from the world and knowing the untainted real self which transcends the assertions that it is one or that it is manifold. Here the sage makes a statement which at first would seem to be inaccurate. He says that all of us are lovers of the egoless state, which is to be won by turning aside from the world. And since we are to turn our backs on the world, after all, it does not matter to us what the world may be. But few are the persons who have heard of the egoless state, and still fewer are those that want that state. What then does the sage mean by saying that all men, without exception, are devotees of that state? The sage himself has furnished the explanation, which is in perfect harmony with the teachings of the ancient lore. It is as follows. It is true that not all are conscious lovers of the egoless state, but unknowingly they do love that state, and they show that love by their great partiality to a state which has great resemblance to the egoless one, namely the state of dreamless sleep. This state is far inferior to the egoless state, as we shall see later. It is a happy state, but its happiness bears no comparison at all with that of the egoless state. However, it is exactly similar to the egoless state in being egoless and worldless. It will be seen later that the egolessness is imperfect. Because it is egoless, it is also worldless, and this it is that makes it happy. The sage tells us that one that is in love with sleep, in spite of its imperfection, cannot be heard to say that he does not love the egoless state. For this reason, if only we knew what it is that we really want, it would be unnecessary for us to discuss the world. It is the self that should interest us, not the not-self. Therefore, says the sage, it is absurd to investigate the not-self, as it would be absurd for a barber to scrutinize the heaps of shorn hair instead of putting it in the dustbin. All inquiries about the not-self are vain, if not mischievous, because it delays the main enterprise, the quest of the self. And this is so even if one arrives at the correct conclusion about the nature of the world, if he does not then at least commence that quest. But for those that are in earnest to find the self, without being able to pursue the quest with one-pointed mind, this inquiry is neither unnecessary nor undesirable. The necessity arises thus. Most men, even those that are in earnest to be delivered from bondage, are hindered in the pursuit of the quest by unwanted thoughts that arise and fill the mind. The habitual flow of the mind is towards the world, not towards the self. Even when one succeeds in turning the mind away from the world and concentrating it on the self, it breaks loose and wanders back to the world. But why do thoughts intrude into the mind even when they are not wanted? The sages say it is because we have the belief that the world is real. The sage of ARUNACHALA tells us in one of his compositions that but for our belief that the world is real, it would be quite easy for us to attain the revelation of the self. The greatest wonder, says the sage, is this, that being always the real self, we are striving to become one with him. He tells us that a day will dawn when we will have to laugh at our present efforts to that end. But that which will be realized on that day of laughter exists even now as the truth, for we are not to become that self. We are he. It may be asked what this belief of ours has to do with the quest. One reason is this. Whatever we hold to be real has an unquestionable right of entry into the mind. Thoughts regarding realities cannot be denied admittance by a mere fiat of the will. But that is not all. We now regard the world as real in a sense in which it is not real, and by so regarding it we make it impossible for ourselves to realize the self until we give up our false belief. It so happens that the very thing that obscures the self for us is the world itself. How can that be? The sages tell us that the self is the reality underlying the world, just as when a rope is mistaken for a snake, the snake obscures the rope, so the world obscures the self. There is only one reality which in our ignorance appears to us as the world, and it will appear as it really is as the self, when we transcend the ignorance. When we shall experience the truth, we shall find that what now appears to us as this multiple world of names and forms and time and space is just the real self, who is the indivisible reality, nameless, formless, timeless, spaceless, and changeless. And it is axiomatic that appearance excludes the reality. As long as the rope is supposed to be a snake, it cannot appear as the rope it really is. The false snake effectually conceals the real rope. The same is the case with the self. So long as the self appears to us as the world, we shall not realize him as the self. The world appearance effectually conceals the self, and it will do so until we get rid of the appearance, and we cannot do so unless we understand that the world appearance is unreal. For this reason, the reality, which is also the self, is practically non-existent for him that believes the world to be real, just as the rope is non-existent for him that sees it as a snake. For this reason, he is Nastika, atheist, even though he may honestly believe that there is a reality. Thus it happens, because of this false belief, the self, who is infinitely great and blissful, and who is our dearest possession, if we may call him a possession, is for the time being lost to us. And what greater loss can there be? But the idea of a self is innate to us. It is not open to us even to doubt the existence of a self of some sort. The self is the only indubitable reality there is. If anyone questions the reality of the self, he would at once put himself out of court. To be able to raise any question at all, he must admit he exists. Therefore it happens that, feeling the void due to the obscuring of the real self, we fill it up with a false self. But since the world is taken as real and we are unable to think of any reality beyond the world, we have to locate this hypothetical self in the world. And this can be only by identifying the self with the body. And as there are two bodies, the physical or gross one and the mental or subtle one, we cannot escape taking one or both of them as the self. It needs to be understood that in both ways we fall into ignorance. The real self is neither the body nor the mind, as we shall see later. By this ignorance we are disabled from conceiving of a real self transcending both mind and body. Thus, unless we are willing to renounce the belief that the world is real as such, that is, as the world, we shall never realize the real self that the sages have testified to. And this means that to get rid of the primary ignorance, we must renounce the belief that the world is real, unless our minds are of such exceptional purity and harmony that we can put away all thought about the world and the body while engaged in the quest. Therefore, we need to listen to what the sages tell us about the world, and accept their teaching at least as tentatively true. The sage of Arunachala tells us that the world is both real and unreal. And he tells us also that there is no self-contradiction in this. The world is real in one sense and unreal in another. The world is real because that which appears as the world is the reality, which is the real self. It is unreal because considered as world, it is a mere appearance of the reality. Apart from the reality, the world has no existence, but its appearance as the world does not affect the reality, for it never really became the world, just as the rope never really became a snake. Thus, we are taught that the world as such is unreal. It is not wholly unreal because there is something, the reality, the self, behind the false appearance. The meaning is that the reality being obscured by the world does not appear to us as it really is. This teaching is briefly referred to as Mayavada. The world is declared to be Maya, an illusory appearance of the reality. Maya may be defined as that mysterious power which makes the real appear as something which it is not. This teaching has come in for a great deal of violent criticism. It is asserted that the teaching is not to be found in the Upanishads, that it is an invention of most recent writers, which was adopted by Bhagavan Sri Shankara. For us, the controversy is set at rest by the testimony of the sage of ARUNACHALA. The teaching that the world is Maya only states a principle known to and admitted by all, namely that things are not what they seem. Modern science, especially physics, has gone far towards confirming it as the fundamental principle of matter, whereas the reality is one, indivisible, unchangeable, untainted, formless, timeless, and spaceless. Our minds picture it as manifold, broken up into an infinite number of fragments, subject to change, tainted by desire, fear, and sorrow, confined in forms, and limited in time and space. This rather long and complicated statement is summarized by the statement that all is Maya. The school of Vedanta which accepts this teaching is called Advaita. Those that are repelled by this teaching are not asked to accept it. It is offered only to those that have realized that the cause of bondage is ignorance and earnestly desire to get rid of it. Their point of view is fundamentally different from that of other people, and the teaching given to them is naturally different. The merit of this teaching lies in its giving us a synthesis of two apparently unconnected teachings of the ancient lore, namely, that the reality is the material cause of the world and that it remains unaffected, transcending all duality. Those that are determined to believe that the reality has really become all this multiplicity are not called upon to accept the teaching. For them, the ancient lore and sages have provided other ways of spiritual progress. The sages are not at all annoyed if these people assert that their way is alone the right way, but if ignorance is to be transcended, there is no escape from accepting this teaching. For if the world be real as such, there would be no unchangeable reality, without which there can be no deliverance. Thus, the teaching about the world is really twofold. But that part of the teaching which says that the real self is the truth underlying the world appearance is separable from the other part. Besides, the latter part, namely, that the world is not real as such, is of greater value to us to begin with because it serves as an antidote to the false belief that the world is real as such. The former part of the teaching is also more difficult of comprehension. Hence, the sages recommend the cultivation of the belief that the world is unreal, even though it is not the whole truth about the world. Those who are unable to assimilate the whole teaching would be on the safe side if they accept that part of it which says that the world is unreal. This will be the safe course, because the alternative to the view of the world's unreality is often that the world is real as world. For the average mind, it is so made that it cannot be held in suspense on any question that is raised. It must have an answer one way or other to any question that is raised. Reasons for the view that the world is unreal as such are given in ample measure. We shall now consider these. The first reason is the fact of the ignorance that is at the root of all our experience. Once the sage was asked the following question: how can I accept the teaching that the world, which I am sensing all the time in so many ways, is not real? The sage answered, this world, which you try to prove to be real, is all the time mocking at you for seeking to know it without you first knowing yourself. If once we realize that we do not know ourselves aright, how can we pretend that we know the world aright? The sage has expressed this argument as follows: how can the knowledge of objects arising in relative existence to one that knows not the truth of himself, the knower, be true knowledge? If one rightly knows the truth of him named I, in whom both knowledge and its opposite subsist, then along with ignorance, relative knowledge also will cease. To one that can feel the full force of this argument, no further discussion is needful. The teaching that the world is not real as such will become self-evident as soon as one comes to feel that ignorance of the self is the one source of all worldly knowledge. But meanwhile, some more detailed discussion of the question will be useful. The second reason is that our belief that the world is real as such is not based on any reliable evidence. We shall presently discuss the evidence offered in proof of the reality of the world, but first we need to meet an objection that may be raised. It may be objected that in asserting that there is no satisfactory proof of the reality of the world, we are simply throwing the burden of proof on the other side, on him that says that the world is real. The answer to this is that the burden of proof does lie on him that asserts the existence of the world. The burden of proof does not lie on him that denies its existence. In courts of law, it is a rule of evidence that the burden of proof lies on him that asserts something, not on him that is content with the denial of the assertion. And this is a perfectly sound rule. There is no reason why different rules should be observed in philosophy. The reason for this rule is that a denial is usually incapable of proof, while an assertion of something positive, as that something exists, is capable of proof. The one that denies is thus entitled to win his case if the asserter is not able to let in clear evidence of the existence of the thing asserted by him. If the asserter fails to adduce a clear and unobjectionable evidence to prove his case, the judgment will go against him. Thus the burden of proof is rightly thrown on those that contend that the world is real as such. We shall examine the evidence that is adduced by them, and if the evidence be inconclusive, we shall have to conclude that their case is baseless. Of course, there is the clear evidence of the sages which is decisive, but we need not refer to it for the present. Before we begin this discussion, we need to set up a standard of reality which shall be rigorously applied. We cannot make use of the standard of reality that is in common use, because it is an instrument of the primal ignorance that vitiates all our knowledge. We must go to the sages for a standard of reality that would guide us aright. This standard of reality is thus expressed: that alone is real, which exists unchanged and without intermission. This means that things whose existence is limited by time or space are not real. This test of reality has been handed down from time immemorial and is found recorded in the Bhagavad Gita, chapter 2:16, as follows. Existence never belongs to the unreal, nor does non-existence belong to the real. We see the same test of reality implied in the Chandogya Upanishad, where reality and appearance are contrasted. Acharya Gaudapada, who is reverenced by sage Shankara as an adept in the meaning of the sacred lore as handed down by tradition, states the test of reality thus. Whatever has no existence before and after does not exist even now. The meaning of both is the same. The Gita verse tells us that a thing is not real simply because it seems to exist at some time, because a thing that really exists is never without existence. Gaudapada simply applies this principle and gives the result, namely, that a thing which begins to appear at some time and ceases to appear afterwards is really non-existent all the time. Thus, continuity of existence without change is the test of reality. Such continuity, however, is only evidence of transcendence of time and the other elements of relativity. Reality is not in time, nor in space, nor is it related to anything else as cause or effect. This is the strictly philosophical definition of reality according to the sages. Transcendence of causality is very important. It implies that changelessness is an inalienable quality of the real, and this is as it should be. For a thing that has undergone a real change is no longer the same thing. The fact that a thing has suffered a change shows that it was never real. Things that are in time and space are subject to change, because they are divisible into parts. Thus earth, being divisible, can be made into a great variety of things. Hence it is not real. Thus indivisibility is also a test of reality. We shall see later how this test is applied. It is also axiomatic that the real is a thing that exists in its own right, independently of other things. Whatever has a dependent existence is unreal. Thus, things formed out of some material such as earth, wood, or metal are unreal. As compared to the things made out of them, it may be said that the materials are real. For this reason, the sacred lore and sages freely illustrate the unreality of the world by comparing it to objects made of such materials and the reality, the cause of the world, to the materials. For example, a pot is made of earth. Therefore, it has no independent existence. Such existence as it seems to have is derived from the earth. The pot, therefore, says the ancient lore is only conventionally a pot, but really it is only earth. Before it was made, it was only earth, and after it is broken, it will be earth, and even now it is only earth, with the name and form of a pot. Therefore, it is earth all the time. As its appearance as pot is transitory, we are told that the pot is unreal as pot, though it may be real as earth. This reality as earth is only relative, not only because earth is divisible and changeable, but also because, being in time and space, it has no continuous existence. In the same way, the world, which is an appearance in the real, is only conventionally the world, having no existence of its own, independently of the real. Therefore, it is unreal as world, being nothing but the real all the time. But the teaching must not be limited by the analogy, because there is this vital difference, that the reality never suffered a real change. The unreality of the world should be understood by us, so we are told by the sage, by means of three analogies, namely, the rope mistaken for a serpent, the wasteland on which a mirage appears, and dreams. the sage has told us that all the three analogies are necessary and should be taken together. For the truth we seek is transcendent and cannot be explained adequately by means of a single analogy. We have seen the use of the first analogy. But when a rope is first mistaken for a serpent and then recognized to be a rope, the serpent ceases to appear. That does not seem to be the case with the world. Even when it is known that the world is only an appearance of the real self, the world continues to appear. This is the objection raised by one that has heard the teaching and been more or less convinced. The correct explanation is that mere theoretical knowledge does not dissolve the world appearance, but only the actual experience of the self. But this explanation may be premature at this stage. Hence, the sage seeks to convince us that a false appearance may continue to be seen even after it is known that the thing is false. This is illustrated by the analogy of the wasteland on which a mirage is seen. The mirage is a false appearance, just like the snake, but it continues to be seen even after it is known that there is no water in the place. We thus see that the mere fact of an appearance persisting is no proof that it is real. But then a further doubt arises. The disciple says the case of the mirage is distinguishable. The water of the mirage is conceded to be unreal, because even though it does not cease to appear after the truth of it becomes known, its unreality is proved by the water not being available for quenching thirst. The world is not so, because it continues to serve innumerable purposes. The sage dispels this doubt by appealing to the experience of dreams. The things that are seen in dreams are useful. Food eaten in a dream satisfies dream hunger. In this respect, the state of waking is in no way superior to the dream state. The use of dream objects seems as valid within the dream as the use of waking objects seems valid within the waking state. A man that has just eaten a full meal goes to sleep and dreams that he is hungry, just as a dreamer, having eaten a full dream meal, wakes up hungry. Both are proved false in sleep. This much we have seen from the dream analogy, that a thing may seem to satisfy a need, and yet may be an illusion. The fact is, the need and its satisfaction are both equally unreal. We thus understand that the world is not real as such, because it does not satisfy that test of reality given by the sages. There are a great many religions which do not accept this teaching, which is intended to lift the seeker of the truth out of the morass of ignorance from which he wants to escape. Every one of these religions is based on a set of beliefs or creeds in which more or less of the ignorance that sustains bondage is incorporated. For this reason, the adherents of these religions are unable to accept this teaching. They seek to refute it, but in so doing, they are up against the standard of reality that has been given to us by the sages. They seek to overcome the difficulty in two ways. They deny the standard. All the same, they feel that it is the right one and seek to prove that the world is real according to that standard also. In so doing, they are still uneasy and relieve their consciences by inventing degrees of reality, a most unphilosophical device, condemned by all the sages. It may be here noted that a concession is made to human weakness by the sages. The world is unreal from the point of view of the absolute truth, but it is as good as real so long as ignorance retains its sway over our minds. Thus it happens that these believers have no real grievance against the sages. The teaching does not mean that the world is not real for those that fully believe that the body or the mind is the self, who do not feel that this is ignorance, and do not at all want to get rid of it. The ancient lore is twofold. One part of it is addressed to those who are not conscious of being in ignorance, and therefore have no use for the teaching intended to dispel that ignorance. The other part of the ancient lore is addressed to those that are conscious of the ignorance and are in earnest to escape from it. These two parts are quite distinct, but this feature of the ancient revelation is not known to these believers. Besides, they are offended by the inevitable corollary that theirs is a lower position. They also feel it is a grievance that the world which they believe to be real should be dismissed as unreal, and often want to quarrel with us who are followers of the sages. We, however, have no quarrel with them, as the sages have pointed out, because we realize that for them it is all right to believe as they do, and so believing to make the best of the world while it lasts. They are like dreamers who are persuaded that their dreams are real and do not want to awake. We have begun to see that this worldly life is only a dream, because the sages tell us so, and we want to awake. That the world has no existence of its own is stated by the sage as follows. The world and the mind arise and set together as one. But of the two, the world owes its appearance to the mind alone. That alone is real, in which this inseparable pair, the world and the mind, has risings and settings. That reality is the one infinite consciousness, having neither rising nor setting. We are thus reminded of a fact not unknown to us, but of which the importance has till now escaped us. The world begins to appear just when the mind comes into being, after remaining merged and lost in sleep. It continues to appear only as long as the mind continues to function. It disappears with the mind when the latter is dissolved in sleep. It is seen again only when the mind comes again into being on waking. When the mind is lost in sleep, there is no world appearance. From this it follows that neither the mind nor the world is real. This is so, not only because they do not appear continuously, but also because they have no existence of their own independently of the reality, in which their risings and settings take place. Here also, the standard of reality as defined by the older sages is clearly accepted and applied. It may perhaps be contended that the world does not appear only because there is no mind or senses to perceive it. The answer is very simple. It is true that in sleep there is no mind, but we are there. And if the world were real, what is there to prevent its appearing to us? That there is no mind or sense organs in sleep is no reason for the world not being seen. The real self does not need any medium to see whatever is real. The sacred lore tells us that the self is the eye of consciousness, by which alone the mind and the senses are able to perceive. His power of being aware of reality, say all the Vedantas, is never lost. We do not see the world in sleep because the world does not exist. The sage has also said the same thing in a different form. The world is not other than the body. The body is not other than the mind. The mind is not other than the primal consciousness. The primal consciousness is not other than the reality that exists unchanging in peace. The question may be asked, how can we be sure of the existence of the reality, which is here said to be the source from which mind and world arise, and into which they set? The answer is that this unreal pair cannot appear and disappear without something real in which they can have their risings and settings. Our chief difficulty in accepting this teaching is this. We have become accustomed to the thought that the world exists outside of us, and that we ourselves are the body, or that we are the mind which is in the body. We have also assumed that the mind is an exceedingly small thing as compared with the world, and that it makes it difficult for us to conceive how this wide world can be in the mind, or can be one with the mind. This difficulty is connected with another of our false assumptions, namely that time and space are real, because time and space are inseparable elements of the world appearance. When the world appears, it does so with time and space, and when it vanishes in sleep or in the egoless state, time and space do not remain. The simple solution of the difficulty lies in this, that all these assumptions are outgrowths of the primary ignorance, the ego sense, and are therefore discredited. Because of this notion, namely that the world is outside of us and consists of objects perceived through our sense organs, the world is taken to be an objective reality, as opposed to mere thoughts, which are admitted to be subjective and therefore unreal. The sages tell us that this objectivity is a gratuitous assumption, that in fact the world exists only in the mind. The sage of ARUNACHALA states the position thus: the world is nothing but the five sensations, namely sounds and the rest of its kind. Thus the world consists of the objects of the five sense organs. The one mind becomes aware of these five sensations through the five senses. That being the case, how can the world be other than the mind? Here the sage draws our attention to a fact upon which philosophers of all grades are now agreed, thanks to the elaborate demonstration by Immanuel Kant, namely that what all we perceive is not the world itself, whose reality is in question, but an ever-shifting mass of sensations, namely sounds, contacts, forms, taste, and smell. That these sensations are not outside, if there be any outside at all, but only inside, that is, in the mind, is undeniable. This is freely admitted even by some scientists who would not profess to be philosophers. They are thoughts arising in the mind. Along with these thoughts arises the thought that there is an outside in which things exist, which are the origin of these sensations. It may be noted that an exactly similar conviction arises during dreams also, and persists in full force until the dreams come to an end. Those that maintain the objective reality of the world are bound to prove by unobjectionable evidence that these sensations are really caused by objects existing outside, because the burden of proof lies on them. The presumption is against their case, for the reason shown by the sages. The world, they say, is real. They contend that it does not become unreal simply because it does not appear to some who are unable to see it, being asleep. They allege that while some are asleep, others keep awake and see the world. So the world is being seen all the time by someone or other. They add up the waking states of all persons whom they suppose to exist as distinct individuals, and thus make out that there is a continuous world appearance. And this, they say, proves that the world is real. If a person awaking from sleep remembers that he did not see the world during sleep and thus doubts whether the world existed during the time he slept, he has only to ask someone who remained awake and learn from him that the world was seen by him during the interval. The evidence is inconclusive. In fact, it is not evidence at all. Let us take the case of a sleeper who on waking wants to ascertain by unimpeachable evidence whether or not the world continued to exist during the time he slept. Let us even suppose that this inquirer assumed that time existed when he slept, and is therefore real. He is asked to accept the evidence of those that did not sleep at the time. But these witnesses are themselves part of the world, whose reality is in question. The sleeper doubts the reality of the world because it does not appear to him in sleep, even though the world has begun to appear again in his waking. Does not this doubt cover these witnesses also? He was not aware of them in his sleep, as the sage pointed out to an objector. Therefore their reality is as doubtful as the reality of the world as a whole. How is that doubt to be dispelled? For the awakened sleeper to admit them as witnesses, there must be some independent evidence to prove that they are real. No such evidence is offered. He is supposed to accept the realities simply because he sees them. That he had seen them before he slept does not make any difference, because the same is the case of the world. Thus the argument is simply a subtle way of begging the question. The presumption that the world is unreal is not only unaffected but strengthened. It is as near conclusive proof as can be expected. There is another argument for the objectivity of the world, namely that it appears the same to all observers. It is questionable whether the world appears the same to all. It is common experience that there are wide differences among men in their views of the world. But let us suppose that there is substantial agreement among all observers. The sage tells us that this argument is invalid, because it involves the false assumption that there are different observers. He explains the apparent agreement among observers as being due to the fact that there is only one observer in all of them. Hence the uniformity of the world appearance is not due to the reality of the world. Thus the argument fails. The truth is this: the mind itself, by its own power of self-deception, creates hypothetical world corresponding to its sensations, along with the container of the world and outside, and projects it into the outside. This creation and projection are involuntary and unconscious processes, and hence the mind never questions the existence of an outside and of an objective world in this outside. If the mind consciously and deliberately created the world, it would be able to create a much pleasanter world. It is unable to do this because the process of creation is not conscious. This we see in dreams. There the mind creates its own dream world, but it is no pleasanter than this waking world. Often it is worse, as in nightmares, which are like hell. That the mind has this power of self-deception, itself creating a world and being deceived by it, is what we see in actual experience. We have just now seen that this power is the cause of dreams. The dream world appears real while the dream lasts. If in the dream the dreamer doubts the reality of what he sees and tries to find out the truth, he always concludes not that he is dreaming, but that he is wide awake. In fact, nature never allows anyone to go on dreaming and at the same time know that he is dreaming. But this power can be seen at work in waking too. By its power of abstraction, the mind can impart to whatever it imagines a semblance of reality, by which it is itself deceived for the time being, just as in dreams. The sense of reality varies according to the concentration of the mind and the consequent vividness of the mental images created. When witnessing a well-planned and well-acted play on a stage, we are deceived into a belief, however short-lived, that what we see is real. The same thing happens when we are reading a novel written by a great literary artist. In both cases, the characters and events have no real existence, but they rouse powerful emotions in us because of the illusion of reality created by the artist and assisted by our own imagination. If the illusion be feeble, as when the skill of the artist is not up to the mark, the emotions aroused, if any, are also feeble, and we are not deceived. It is a fact that so far as unintentional creation is concerned, all living beings are endowed with a higher degree of artistic skill than any artist that has ever existed. We think that children have a much higher degree of this power than adults. We fail to notice the same power in ourselves. because our mental creations are disciplined by the drill at school and in the drudgery of life into a degree of uniformity with the creations of other minds, whose very existence is itself a creation of mind. We are aware of this self-deception in every case in which it comes to an end, as on waking from a dream, on laying down a book, or on the curtain falling on a play. When, however, the illusion is not lifted, naturally we are unable to see that we are being deceived. The only way to end this self-deception is to win the direct experience of the real self. There is no other way. We shall see later, when we discuss the three states of our life in ignorance and contradistinction from the egoless state, that the experience is the waking from this dream of relativity and bondage. The sage has given us further proofs of the untenability of the belief in the reality of the world as such. Distinctions and variety are the very life and soul of the world appearance. All these are the progeny, says the sage, of the primal ignorance. Among these distinctions, we find time and space. Have we any proof that time and space are objective realities? If there is no proof to that effect, then it will be ridiculous to contend that the world is real as such. Philosophers of the West, from the time of Kant, have been familiar with the theory that space, time, and causality are the mind's creation. Recent developments in physical science, beginning with the theory of relativity enunciated by Einstein, make the case stronger still. But the strongest argument against the truth of time and space is that given to us by the sage of ARUNACHALA, which we shall study in due course. According to Einstein, time and space are not two distinct realities. There is only one thing that can be said to exist, namely space-time, not two things, space and time. But this space-time is never directly experienced. It is just a hypothetical entity which is assumed by physicists in order to help them to understand or think they understand physical phenomena. No layman, no one who is not a mathematical physicist, can ever understand this space-time. The world thus conceived is no longer an objective reality, but an abstraction represented by a mathematical equation. Thus, the scientists have proved to us that time and space are illusions arising in a thing called space-time. But this new entity has not even the testimony of sense experience in its favor. We shall now see what we can learn from the sage. He is emphatic that neither time nor space is real. He says, "Where are time and space apart from the sense of I? If we were the same as bodies, then it could be said that we are in time and space. But are we bodies? We are the same at all times and in all places. Hence, we are that reality which transcends time and space. Time and space are mental forms, coming into existence subjectively after the ego's sense. In sleep there is neither time nor space. When we awake, there sprouts up the ego, saying, I am the body. It thus creates time and space and locates therein the body and the world. When the ego sets in sleep, all these things cease also. Therefore it is said that time and space have no existence apart from the ego, and the ego and the mind are practically the same. Therefore they are mental. If it be objected that we have the experience of being bound and held in time and space, the sage answers that this is an illusion, due to the notion, I am the body. The body alone is in time and space. What then are we? What is our true nature? The sage tells us that we are neither the body nor the mind, but the eternal I am, which is unchangeable, and which runs like a thread through the succession of thoughts. In every thought there is this, I am young, I am grown up, I am old, I am a male, I am righteous, I am the sinner. In all these thoughts, the I am is the constant factor. It never changes its nature. It only seems to do so by the confusion of the real self, who is this I am, with the body. This confusion gives rise to the ego sense. Time and place appear in and by this I am, but do not affect him. This I am is not a thought of the mind. It is the real self, transcending time and space. We should reject the varying thoughts that pass and isolate the pure I am, which is the self. If we do so, says the sage, we shall find that he is timeless and spaceless. Since these do not survive the death of the ego, they are unreal. We may here take this to heart. Reality is that which exists in the egoless state. It is possible that some of us may be perplexed rather than convinced by these considerations, but only the most obtuse-minded can resist the conclusion that there is no clear evidence to show that time and space and the world that seems to fill them are objective realities existing independently of the mind that imagines them. The following consideration may be of some help. Time and space are always imagined to be infinite. We cannot help imagining so, but there is no proof that they are infinite. When we dream, we find both time and space as our dream has a beginning. We ought, if we are seeing reality, be able to know then and there in the dream that dream time had a beginning. But we are not able to do so. Only when we awake do we find out that we were mistaken. There is no substantial difference between dream time and waking time in this respect. Since time does not really exist, there is no past, nor future, nor even the present, nor can there have been anything like a creation of the world. Also, all things that presuppose time are unreal, so we had no past births, nor shall have any in the future. Nor are we now embodied, nor can death be real. Neither can there be actions done in the past whose fruits we would reap. Nor are we now doers of action, the fruits of which would be reaped by us in future. This is absolute, undiluted truth, as experienced by all sages. This, however, does not affect the relative validity of the beliefs of the layman. Since space is an illusion, the distinction between inside and outside, without which the world cannot be an objective reality, also becomes unreal. Thus, all the multitudinous limitations which have always appeared to pertain to us are shown to be illusory. Since there is no outside, there are not only no inanimate objects, but also no living persons in that outside. We have seen already that many of the arguments for the world's reality took for granted the multiplicity of persons located in space. This idea is clearly an outgrowth of the ego sense, the I sense being limited to the body of the seer. He cannot help imagining that in every body that he sees there is a person. Thus the notions of you and he arise, and these are ignorance. The sage expresses this as follows. When the sense of I am the body arises, then the notions of you and he also arise. But when by the quest of the truth underlying the I sense is put an end to, then the notions of you and he also cease. That which then shines as the sole remainder is the true self. The following episode, taken from Vishnu Purana, to which the writer's attention was drawn by the sage, may help to a clear understanding of the whole question. It tells how sage Ribhu instructed his disciple Nidaga. The sage went in disguise to the disciple and found him in his native town. The disciple failed to recognize the sage. He took him for some rustic that had come sightseeing. Just then a royal procession was going along, and the sage asked what it was. Then the following dialogue took place. Nidaga said, "The king of this place is going in a procession." "Who is the king?" "The one who is seated on the elephant." "What is the elephant, and which the king?" "The one that is above is the king, and the one that is below is the elephant." "I do not understand your meaning. Please explain it more clearly." The disciple wondered at the profound ignorance of the seeming rustic. To make him understand, he got upon the shoulders of the sage and said, "Look here, I am above, like the king, and you are below, like the elephant." The sage said, "If, as you say, you are above, like the king, and I am below, like the elephant, then make me understand what you mean by I and you." Then Nidaga jumped down in haste and fell at Ribu's feet and said, "Surely thou art my holy master Ribu, for no one else has such an unfailing awareness of the profound truth of non-duality." Ribu told him that that was the teaching he needed, and went away. Thus it was that Nidaga was instructed in the truth of the real self. He was led on step by step, and finally told that the difference between one person and another is unreal, and that there is only one real self. Individuality and the plurality of souls are illusions, the offspring of the ignorance I am the body. This very ignorance is the sole root of all sense of difference. The notions of above and below seem to be true to the disciple in this story, only because he identified himself with one body and the sage with another. The bodies were above and below, not the self. The self transcends all differences. The distinction of inside and outside is no more real than that of above and below, and without it there is no world. It is also this very ignorance that makes us assume that the mind is insignificantly small, located in a corner of the body, the brain. This false belief makes it difficult for us to conceive how this vast universe can be in the mind. We even think it ridiculous. The sage of ARUNACHALA tells us that this notion of ours is an inversion of the truth. He says that it is the mind that is vast, not the world. The knower is ever greater than the known, and the seer than the seen. That which is known is in the knower, and that which is seen is in the seer. The vast expanse of the sky is in the mind, not outside, because the mind is everywhere and there is no outside to it. The infinite universe being contained in this seemingly external sky is also in the mind. Even the great gods, whom the devotees adore, and their respective heavens, are in the mind alone. That divinity which is conceived as different from the devotee is only relatively real. The true divinity is the reality, in which worshipper and worshipped are one, the mind that differentiates them having no place there. Thus, everything that the mind thinks of or thinks it sees, the body, the objects of sense, the other bodies supposed to be other persons, heaven, hell, and other regions of worlds, is inside and not outside. The root of all these superstitions is the initial error of taking it for granted that one single body is the self, and all the rest not self. And because of this ignorance, we do not think of questioning the correctness of this or any other belief that arises out of this ignorance. Once we awake to the fact that we have been deceiving ourselves as to the truth of the self, in accepting as true the illusion that the body is the self, we shall have little difficulty in accepting, at least tentatively, the teaching that the world is not an objective reality. We are told by the sage that the world is unreal because it is nothing but the 5 kinds of sensations. Among the 5 sensations, there is one which merits special consideration, namely form. Without the sensation of forms, we cannot become subject to the primary ignorance, the ego sense. The ego comes into being by taking hold of a form, a body, confounding that form with the real self and thus limiting the real self. The question whether forms are real is therefore separately dealt with by the sage. He says, if the self be with form, then the world and God would be so too. But if the self be formless, then how and by whom are forms to be seen? Is the spectacle ever otherwise than as the seeing eye? The real eye is just the real self. It is infinite consciousness, formless and worldless. The meaning was explained by the sage himself as follows. If the eye that sees be the eye of flesh, then gross forms are seen. If that eye be assisted by lenses, then even invisible things are seen to have form. If the mind be the eye, then subtle forms are seen. Thus the seeing eye and the objects seen are of the same nature. That is, if the eye be itself a form, it sees nothing but forms. But neither the physical eye nor the mind has any power of vision of its own. The real eye is the self, as he is formless, being the pure and infinite consciousness, the reality. He does not see forms. Forms are created by the very act of seeing. From this we learn that forms appear only because of the ego sense, the primary ignorance. For him that still seeks to evade the inevitable conclusion, namely that the world has no objective reality, the sages appeal to our experience in dreams. We have already considered dreams as showing that use does not prove reality. We also need to see that the notion of externality and objectivity can be a delusion. And here, dreams are helpful. When we dream, we fully believe that we are seeing an external world composed of persons and things, extended in time and space, substantially similar to the waking world. This idea of externality is the cause of our taking the dream world to be real, and this belief persists so long as we are dreaming. We have not the least doubt at that time that the dream world is outside of us and real. If doubt arises on account of something extraordinary, as when we find ourselves able to fly or see a dead man coming to life, and we begin to suspect that the whole might be a dream, the doubt is somehow overcome and the dream is taken as real until we awake. In fact, the continuance of the dream depends on our believing it to be real. This illusion of reality persists throughout the dream. It is only when we awake that we are able to see that it was only a dream, that there was no external world, but only a mental image which was so vivid as to create the illusion of externality and reality. It may be objected that there is a difference. We awake from a dream and can thus realize its unreality. But our waking experience has no end. We do not have an opportunity to realize its falsity. But we are told by the sages that there is a waking from this dream called waking, and that then the dream will come to an end. This aspect of the question will be discussed later, when we come to discuss the three states of personal experience. Here we are concerned only with the elusiveness of the sense of externality, which is the cause of the sense of reality. He that demurs to this conclusion must be able to tell us of some infallible device by which we can detect the dream nature of dreams while we are dreaming. If there be such a device, it would be one that will enable us to discover the dream nature of waking also. Whether in dream or in waking, if one turns aside from the world and tries to see him that sees that world, the world and its seer would vanish together, and the self alone would remain. These and other considerations must make it easy for us to entertain the view put forward by the sages, that the world is not an objective reality, that it has no existence of its own. There's only one thing that has such existence, namely the real self. This we shall see in a later chapter. Since the world is nothing but mind, the truth of it depends on the truth of the mind. So we have now to see whether the mind, which is the creator of the world, both in waking and in dream, is itself real. The sage points out that the mind is discontinuous. It arises with a ready-made world and sets with it as we were told already. In dreamless sleep there is no mind and no world. Judged by the standard of reality that the sages have given us, the mind is unreal. The mind, says the sage of ARUNACHALA, is nothing but the stream of thoughts that passes over consciousness. Of all these thoughts, the first one is the thought, I am this body. This is a false thought. But because it is taken as true, it is possible for other thoughts to arise. So the mind is just an outgrowth of the primary ignorance and is therefore unreal. That we are not the mind, that the mind is not the self, is clear from this. The mind does not exist in sleep, but we continue to exist in sleep. Besides, the self exists in that state beyond the three states, namely waking, dream, and sleep. We have not exhausted all the possible objections that can be raised by an inveterate believer in the reality of the world. There is, of course, no end to the objections that the ego mind will go on raising, if encouraged to do so. We have noticed already the reason why the mind is so tireless in raising difficulties. The sage has shown us how to deal with the unruly mind when it proves troublesome in this or any other way. The result of all this inquiry is this: to be able to recover our true nature as the real self, we must free ourselves from the superstition that the world is real. Of course, it is not necessary that we should bind ourselves to the opposite belief that the world is unreal. But if it so happens that we cannot give up our present belief in the reality of the world without taking up the opposite belief, namely that the world is unreal, we must take it up even though it is not strictly true, as explained before. The textbooks of the Advaitic lore ask us to steer a middle course if it is possible. They tell us to remember that the world is indefinable as true or untrue, anirvachaniya, and this is philosophically correct, as it is in accord with the teaching of the sages. We may put aside the world and cease thinking about it, understanding that the truth can be realized only by the complete and final extinction of the primary ignorance, by the revelation of the real self, which will come by pursuing the quest taught by the sage. If we cannot do this, we need to relax the grip of the ignorance by reminding ourselves that in all probability the world is just a fantasy of our own errant minds, somewhat like the one depicted by Lewis Carroll in his Alice in Wonderland, where the heroine takes the wonder world that she sees as quite real until the very end. Then she finds that the world was a false appearance, that the men, women, and animals she had been seeing were only a pack of cards. So, too, the emancipated one may find that this solid-seeming world is only a pack of thoughts. It may be useful to point out that the sages do not seek to impose a new faith of their own, but only to release the disciple from the grip of these notions that hinder the quest. The method that is being set forth in these chapters, namely, abstracting the mind from the world by tentatively accepting the view that it is only a pack of thoughts, has been called subjective idealism, because it resembles a somewhat similar view of the world taught by Berkeley. But our idealism, if it be so called, is an aid to the quest of the self. It is not recommended for acceptance by anyone who is not eager to obtain the direct revelation of the authentic self. It differs also from the mere idealism of Berkeley in that it is integrally related to the unique teaching of the sages. that underlying the false appearance, there is the transcendental real self. It is not contended that for all aspirants this is the best of all possible methods. A method is better or worse than another only in relation to a particular person, not generally. It is also true that this is not the only method of escape from bondage. Those whom this method does not suit can follow the path of devotion, which is dealt with later. Such persons are told that the world is real because the reality called God is the material and efficient cause of it. There is no inconsistency in this because, as the sage has often told us, the teaching must ever be suited to the taught.